Well, the transfer portal offseason is never ending as a big-time mid-major guard became available on the first day of August in Boogie Coleman. We take a look at where he might end up on today's Locked On College Basketball.
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hey folks, welcome into the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, the only daily national college hoop show out there, part, of course, of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am your host, Andy Patton, solo episode today. Happy Friday to those of you out there checking out the show on Friday. We're going to have a lot of conversation about conference realignment in future episodes. We're kind of right now waiting, as I'm recording this, waiting to figure out if the Pac-12 is going to be alive by the time you're listening to this show on Friday. It may not. Either way, if we are seeing Oregon and Washington to the Big Ten, if we are seeing Arizona State to the Big 12, we'll discuss what that means for those schools. We'll discuss what it might mean for schools like UConn or Gonzaga or the other remaining schools in the Pac-12. All of that coming next week. But right now, as we're still kind of waiting for those dominoes to fall, we got plenty of other good stuff to talk about today. We're going to talk about some transfer news. We're going to talk about another international star going to a big time program in Kansas, a big influx of international players coming to the States. We're also going to take a look at Mark Madsen's first offseason as the head coach of the Golden Bears at Cal and preview their upcoming season. But first, we're going to lead with the news of another big-time player entering the transfer portal. Boogie Coleman, Jerron Boogie Coleman, hits the transfer portal, a 6'5" guard from Indianapolis out of Ball State. And that's kind of the big story here. Boogie Coleman began his career at Ball State. He played 2 years there and was very good, averaged about 9.5 points as a true freshman, 5 boards, 3 assists, shot 52% from the field, 52% on twos. Next season, he's hurt. He only plays 13 games, but he averages 14 points, 5 boards, 3 assists. Then he transfers and he goes to Mizzou. And a lot of mid-major guys who go to Mizzou or go to a high-profile program, an SEC program, you'll see their minutes dip or you'll see their production dip. And we saw that a little bit with Coleman, but not much. He goes to Mizzou and he plays 29 minutes per game. That's more minutes than he played in either of his first 2 seasons at Ball State. Mind you, there was an injury in the second season. Still, he averages 8.5 points, 3 boards, 2.5 assists. Pretty good numbers. He doesn't really seem to take much of a dip. Mizzou is not the best program necessarily, but still a very quality SEC program, an NCAA tournament team. So for Coleman to seamlessly adjust to going from the MAC at Ball State, going to the SEC and playing well there is a pretty encouraging sign for teams who are looking for him right now. However, he didn't last at Mizzou. He came back to Ball State for his senior year last year, had his most productive season of college basketball, played 34 minutes a night, 14 points per game, 5 rebounds, 3.8 assists, 1.3 steals. Not a super efficient score, only 40% on 2-pointers, about 35% from 3. Regardless, he has now hit the portal. He graduated in late July, got all his credits taken care of. That made him eligible to be a graduate transfer, meaning he can enter the transfer portal at any time, which is what he chose to do. He enters the portal on August 1st. The expectation is that he probably has a destination in mind. As I'm recording this right now, that is not known. There are rumors that he is going to go visit Central Florida, which is probably at least at the front of the line right now in terms of places he might land. We'll talk about a few other spots as well, but really the conversation here is this going to continue to happen? And if so, I mean, if you're Ball State, you have no ability to really replace this player. You lose Boogie Coleman and you don't have time or options or resources potentially to really do anything. You know, Ball State is probably a program that's not throwing out, bunches and bunches of money in the NIL landscape. And if they did have money committed to Boogie, they could, in theory, use that money elsewhere. But on who? The transfer portal, it's not dried up. There are still players out there, but not players anywhere remotely close to the caliber of Boogie Coleman, or at least not ones that would go to Ball State. They could look internationally, but they could look at some uncommitted freshmen. But this is kind of why the offseason extending into August, not even just July, August, is really problematic for some of these players or for some of these teams. And I don't want to sit here and trash Boogie Coleman for making this decision. He made a decision that he felt was right for him for whatever reason. Maybe it was financially based. Maybe he got an opportunity. Maybe there was some behind the scenes poaching going on. Who knows what exactly the situation is? But Matt Norlander, who of course hosts the Norlander and Parrish podcast at CBS, fantastic Ion College Basketball Podcast is what it's called, but fantastic college basketball reporter, wrote a great article talking about and interviewing tons and tons of coaches. They basically said, we're burned out. This was a hard job before, and now there's no off season. There's no breaks. I mean, now you have to scramble to try to figure out how to fix your roster on August 1st. Kansas loses Marcus Adams Jr. They add Johnny Furphy from Australia. We'll talk about that in the second segment. But when teams like Kansas are still making significant roster moves in August, this is unprecedented and difficult for these coaches to navigate. And I think eventually the COVID eligibility is going to really kind of tamper a lot of this down. And I think once that happens, we can maybe then reevaluate, okay, there are still some weird situations. There are still some players showing up late in the process, whatever, but it'll probably feel a lot more subdued. But right now, I mean, this has been a pretty chaotic offseason. I don't think it's particularly controversial to say that. With Coleman, again, Central Florida feels like the maybe front runner at this point. Reports that he's going to take a visit there. Don't know how substantiated those reports necessarily are. Central Florida loses Jelon Young to Memphis. They lose Ithiel Horton. He goes to Texas. Tyum Freeman goes to Kent State. That's 3 guards out the door. They also added Jalen Sellers, from Ball State. So Coleman's old teammate at Ball State went to Central Florida. It certainly seems like a team that is in need of a guard, that might have some money floating around, that has one of his former teammates on it. Makes a lot of sense as a potential landing spot there. However, Coleman is from Indiana, and it is possible that some of the programs in Indiana who have some needs for some guards might end up getting involved here, starting with the flagship program in Indiana. The Hoosiers, Xavier Johnson, Trey Galloway is a solid backcourt. They have some room on their roster. They have some open scholarships. They could conceivably add somebody like Coleman as a third guard, fourth guard, potentially filling that kind of role. Again, if money is a concern here, I'm sure Indiana could rustle some dollars up to maybe pay him more than he was getting at Ball State, put him in a situation where he's going to compete for an NCAA tournament bid, compete to go pretty far in the tournament. I think Indiana with Kalel Ware and Malik Renaud in the front court that they have, and I think they have a chance to do some real damage. And certainly adding somebody like Coleman is not necessarily going to move the needle a lot, but more depth in the backcourt is never, ever a bad thing. Butler, another school in Indiana, could always use more talent. They had a really rough year last year in the Big East. They did bring in quite a few guards in the portal, so they may not have as much room necessarily for somebody like Coleman, but it is a team that is always looking to add to their roster. And then Notre Dame. Notre Dame, of course, lost J.J. Starling and Cormac Ryan to Syracuse and North Carolina, respectively. That was a really tough offseason for the guard room at Notre Dame. Perhaps they will go out and try to bring somebody like Coleman to campus to help shore up the guard room. There are other non-Indiana options and non-UCF options as well that could be a factor here. I think Gonzaga is definitely somebody who might check in here. They've been looking for a Malachi Smith replacement all offseason. They were in on Paul Mulcahy. He went to Washington. They were in on Joe Toussaint. He went to West Virginia. He left, went for West Virginia, went to Texas Tech. They've been in on Jeremiah Williams, who just went to Rutgers. Jose Perez, who of course stayed at West Virginia. So for Gonzaga, a 6'5" guard who's a decent outside shooter might be what they're looking for to put in that backcourt alongside Ryan Nembhard, alongside Nolan Hickman, alongside incoming freshman Dusty Stromer. West Virginia makes some sense as a team that still needs some more bodies to come in. They did bring Jose Perez back, which is very valuable for them. New Mexico State has been very involved in basically every transfer who is available right now. They're checking out DeMar Langford from Boston College. If they can't land Langford, I could see Coleman being the consolation prize for them. Well, Coleman is not the only big news in college basketball these days. The NBA Global Academy in Australia has struck again, with forward Johnny Furphy reclassifying to join Bill Self and the Kansas Jayhawks this season. What does it mean for the Jayhawks? Before we get into that, I want to tell you about today's sponsor, LinkedIn Jobs. These days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. You want to be 100% certain that you have access to the best qualified candidates available. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs, because LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the right people for your team faster and for free. It is so easy to create a free job post, and then you just add your job and the purple hashtag hiring frame to your LinkedIn profile to spread the word that you're hiring. Simple tools like screening questions make it easy to focus on candidates with just the right skills and experience so that you can quickly prioritize who you'd like to interview and ultimately hire. And let's be honest, the right team member can have a positive and measurable impact on your business. This is why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering quality hires versus the leading competitors. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. So post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That is linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Folks, want to thank all of you for making Locked On College Basketball your first listen or your first watch of the day. Shout out to those everyday listeners checking us out on YouTube. Like I said in the beginning, we're going to have a ton of conference realignment talk. You might be listening to the show after Arizona already committed to the Big 12. If that happened, I apologize. It didn't happen when we were recording, but I think it is coming very, very soon. And trust, we will talk all about what those conference realignment moves will mean for college basketball next week. For now, we're going to continue our conversation talking about Bill Self, the Kansas Jayhawks, and their newest addition, Johnny Furphy. He joins the team for the upcoming 2023-24 season. He is a 6'8" forward stretch 4-3 hybrid out of Australia. And I made that reference to the NBA Global Academy because we have seen a lot more success coming out of Australia into the United States from the Global Academy. I know Gonzaga had a player, Alex Tui, who was committed to the program coming out of that Global Academy. He ended up deciding to stay in Australia and play professionally there. That's also something we have seen a fair amount recently. Australia is really trying to build up a kind of younger league, to like a feeder league to their professional ranks, and that has kind of taken away some of that talent coming over to the United States. Not only did Tui stay in Australia, but Taron Armstrong, who was a really good point guard for Cal Baptist the last 2 years, had interest from Gonzaga, had interest from Xavier, a handful of other premier programs, ended up deciding to go to Australia, go back home to Australia, I should say, and play there. Regardless, Furphy is next in a long line of premier European players coming to the United States just in the last couple of weeks. He had initially reclassified to 2024, which is unusual. He basically decided he wanted another year of development before he came to play college basketball. However, after absolutely dominating at the Global Academy on his teams, he was playing extremely well. Self was there. A handful of other coaches were there. He wowed them and started getting a lot of attention, started getting a lot of recruiting, and decided, well, okay, maybe I am ready after all. Reclassified back to the class of 2023 and is now headed to Lawrence, Kansas. Fantastic fit. I'm going to read a quote here from the press release. This is from Bill Self himself. He said, "He is one of the most gifted, skilled young kids in the 2023 class, and certainly as gifted and skilled as any player remaining that we could recruit. He's well beyond his years from his feel and basketball IQ standpoint. The platform at the NBA Global Academy has allowed him to be seen and recruited at this level. We are very excited about him and think his future is very bright." A lot of things stand out in that quote. The main thing is that he made it very clear to say he is as gifted and skilled as any player remaining that we could recruit. And I think that's the key here, because we just saw Kentucky land Ivisic out of Croatia. We just saw UCLA land Ade Mara out of Spain. We have seen a handful of other premier programs. UCLA, I think, has 5 international players on their roster. Arizona has 2 Lithuanians, I think 3 or 4 different Europeans as well. Of course, Gonzaga has always been involved in the international recruiting. They have Junsak Yo from South Korea joined the team at midseason last year. So we are seeing a lot of programs being more invested in adding international talent. There are a couple of reasons for that. I think reason number one is NIL. And I know people are going to say, well, I thought international students couldn't get paid through NIL. And there's some rules that need to be massaged and figured out specifically there. But the short answer is, yeah, international players are getting paid, whether it's how it's happening, whether it's there are complications there, but it is happening. And it is creating a situation where some of these student athletes or incoming student athletes are choosing to come to college rather than staying overseas because they have the ability to make more money and further their quest to make it into the NBA. So we're seeing more of that. And I think the other reason is teams have 2 or 3, 4 scholarships open at times and are looking to fill out their roster. And the transfer portal is pretty barren at this point. We obviously just talked about Boogie Coleman, and he's a player that is going to get some Power 5 attention, I suspect, but he's one of the few that's kind of in the portal right now that really merits that kind of consideration. So I think if you're looking to fill out spots on your roster, and Kansas was primarily because they lost Marcus Adams Jr., who of course decommitted from Kansas, ultimately ended up filling that spot at Gonzaga that had been for Alex Tui. So it kind of circles all the way back around here. But Kansas decided there is nobody available here, either in high school in the class of 2023 or available in the portal, that is better than the options that we are seeing overseas. And Kentucky obviously came to the same conclusion, and UCLA has come to a similar conclusion as well. And I think that it's something we're going to continue to see. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. I think when you look at college basketball, and we're starting to see some of the premier high school talent opting not to play college basketball and instead play for G League Ignite or Overtime Elite, or go overseas in some cases. And so I think to keep college basketball as talent driven as we can, continuing to find other ways to add to those rosters. There are teams that have been hitting the international market hard for a really long time. I mentioned Gonzaga and Arizona. They are 2 of the best at it. Tommy Lloyd was exceptional at recruiting international talent while he was the associate head coach at Gonzaga. This is where they get players like Roni Turioff, Domantas Sabonis, Shemet Karnowski, Killian Tilly, Joel Ayayi. The list goes on and on and on. And then he goes to Arizona and starts doing the same thing. Starts recruiting similar amount of they have a ton of players coming in to their roster this upcoming season. UCLA has been doing it for a while as well. And trust me, there are plenty of other programs I'm not mentioning that are very good about doing this as well. But I think we're going to see it start to spread a little bit more. It's not something historically that Kentucky and Kansas have done all that much. And now we're starting to see that, in part because they're having a harder time keeping players on their roster. They're losing players. Guys might commit to them, be a top 20, top 50, top 75 recruit in the class. And after a year, they decide they want to go somewhere else because they're not playing. International students, maybe they feel they're less likely to do that. Maybe they feel they're more ready to actually contribute right away. There are a variety of different factors. And of course, every situation is a little bit different. They're not all lumped together in the same thing. But it is interesting that we're seeing this kind of influx right at the end of the kind of roster building season. I say the end, but it doesn't seem like it's ever really done. There are plenty of teams that are not done filling out their roster, and it is already the first week of August. That is unusual, but it is part of the deal in the modern college basketball landscape. Regardless, exciting addition for Kansas. I wouldn't expect to see a ton from Furphy in year 1. I think he's probably, again, he's more of a replacement for Marcus Adams Jr., who nobody really expected to play a big role for Kansas right away. However, the depth behind Kevin McCullar at the 3 for Kansas is a bit limited. So I think it's possible that he could play some backup 3 minutes. Maybe he could play some small ball 4 alongside Dickinson. Maybe if Dickinson is off the floor and they play KJ Adams in that 5 role, they could play Furphy at the small ball 4 there. I still wouldn't expect to see a ton of minutes from him. Bill Self is pretty tight on his rotations at Kansas, as many of the premier programs in college basketball are. So I wouldn't expect to see a ton of him. But again, he's a guy who was planning until very recently to not even start playing college basketball until next year. So the hope for Kansas is that he is willing to be patient, not play a ton this year, develop behind the scenes, and maybe blossom into a guy who's a big contributor for this team, maybe as soon as year 2, but at least in the coming years. We're going to close out the show with another segment in our series discussing head coaches at new spots. We talked about this with a couple of VCU coaches. We talked about this at New Mexico State with Jason Hooten. Now, today, we're going to talk about Mark Madsen taking over for the Golden Bears at Cal. More on that after a word from today's sponsor, eBay Motors. For a championship team, it is all about making sure every player is a perfect fit. And it's the same when it comes to your vehicle. Every part needs to fit just right. So the next time you need parts and accessories, head to eBay Motors. With the eBay Guaranteed Fit, you can be sure every part you need fits right the first time around. Just add your ride to My Garage and look for the green check to know the part will fit, or you get your money back. Because just like in sports, confidence is the name of the game when you shop on eBay Motors. And with over 122 million parts to choose from, you'll be back in the game in no time. After all, it's easy to bring home a win when the right parts are guaranteed. Get the right parts, the right fit, and the right prices on ebaymotors.com. eBay Motors or eBay Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. It is on eligible items only, and exclusions do apply. All right, folks, closing out the show today with our series discussing head coaches at new jobs. Always fun to see how a program might shift after bringing in a new head coach. Sometimes it goes very, very poorly, like it did at New Mexico State last year with their hiring of Greg Heyer. Sometimes it goes extraordinarily well, and you see programs that have maybe been in the dumps for a while start to turn things around. And that is certainly what the people of Berkeley, California are going to be hoping for with the hiring of Mark Madsen. Mark Madsen, of course, the coach at Utah Valley, was hired to replace Mark Fox. Mark Fox did not have a lot of success with the Golden Bears. He went 38-87. I had to do a double take when I was looking up his numbers because that is an astonishingly bad record to do at Cal. And look, I know that Cal is not a program that is dealing out a lot of financials to help these coaches. I think that's the best way to put it. They're not particularly interested in spending the kind of money that you would need to spend to even keep up with other schools in the Pac-12 or what is left of the Pac-12 as we're recording this. But regardless, that is abysmal. And he went 3-29 last year, and they finally said, all right, that's enough. And they pulled the plug, and they went out and hired the guy that I just cannot believe Stanford didn't hire. Mark Madsen, the Mad Dog, an iconic basketball player from Stanford. Iconic. And Stanford has been better than Cal, but probably needed to make a coaching change with Jared Haas. Haas, not a bad coach. Again, there's some limitations there with finances and whatnot, and he's a good recruiter. They've brought in really talented players, but the end result on the court has just not worked. And they had the ability to bring in a legacy alum, get some interest drummed up around the program. They chose not to do it, and they watched their biggest rival hire him. We'll see how it pans out for Stanford, but I think this might have been a pretty big mistake by the Cardinal front office. Madsen, 70-51 in his 4 seasons at Utah Valley, was a 2-time WAC champion, and they went 28-9 last season. That was in a year where people didn't expect them to be all that good. They'd lost Dawes Amack, who transferred to Texas Tech, and spoiler alert, has transferred now to Cal to play under his old coach. Utah Valley lost a lot of talent, and people were kind of unsure what they would look like. They go out and nearly win 30 games, and that was enough for people to start noticing, okay, Madsen's not a guy who should be coaching at this level a whole lot longer, and he lands himself a Power 6 job at Cal. And clean house, which is totally what you'd expect him to do. This Cal team, 3-29. I mean, they were one of the worst Power 6 basketball individual seasons we've seen in a really long time. And if it weren't for Louisville doing what Louisville did last year and were just unbelievably horrendous, I think Cal would have gotten a little bit more attention. Less people care about Cal. They didn't win a national championship in 2013 the way that Louisville did, but still really startling to see Cal be this horrendous. So Madsen comes in, 9 players leave via the transfer portal. Their second and third leading scorers, among them Lars Thiemann, who goes to LMU, and then Kuani, who goes to VCU. 2 post players for them there that are out the door. They do bring back Devin Askew, who was their starting point guard last year, 15.5 points per game. A nice player to still have in the mix. And then to bring in 6 more players via the transfer portal. One of them, Dawes Amack. Amack, of course, a player who starred at Utah Valley. I think he averaged like 19 and 15 with 2 blocks per game in his final season with the Wolverines, was a really highly touted, highly regarded, highly sought after player in the transfer portal. He ends up going to Texas Tech. Things do not go well for Amack at Texas Tech. He gets injured before the season. He feels that he got rushed back from his injury and wasn't fully healthy when he played last year. Played okay, but wasn't exactly his best. Ends up entering the transfer portal after the season. Of course, Mark Adams loses his job at Texas Tech, and we saw a significant amount of roster churn for that program. But Amack follows his coach. And this is another reason why Stanford, I think, really dropped the ball here, because this seemed obvious that this was going to happen, that Madsen was going to be able to get dudes, at the very least, was going to be able to land Amack, and he does. Amack at Cal is going to be a really nice fit. If he's fully healthy, I think he's going to be a sneaky good big in a conference that has some really solid bigs in it. You got Umar Ballo, and you got Nafale Dante at Oregon, Ballo, of course, at Arizona. I think it's going to be fun to see. And now Daymara at UCLA as well. Be fun to see how Amac plays alongside those guys. Amac brings his teammate along with him in Jalen Tyson. Tyson averaged 10.5 and 6 boards at Texas Tech last year as a sophomore. So he's still got a couple years of eligibility. Could be one of, if not the leading scorer at Cal next season. He's going to be a really big part. They also bring in Jalen Cone from Northern Arizona. Spent 2 years at NAU, averaged 18 and 3. He had been at Virginia Tech before that and was a legitimate contributor for VTech. So a guy who has done it for 2 years in the ACC and absolutely dominated at a lower level. So should come in and bring some good stuff to the Golden Bears at the point guard position. And if that's not enough, they also added 2 sharp shooting combo guards to bring into the mix as well. Keontae Kennedy comes over from Memphis. He's a graduate transfer, so they get some experience from him. Last year with Penny Hardaway's squad, he averaged 9 points on 38% from deep. And then they get Mike Meadows. Mike Meadows comes over from the University of Portland. He had been at Eastern Washington prior to that, but he followed his coach Shante Leggins from Eastern to UP. Another grad transfer, averaged 11 points per game for the Pilots last year on 36% shooting. So you had a couple combo guards who can really light it up from deep. You had a high-scoring point guard in Jalen Cone to pair alongside Askew. You add a combo forward in Jalen Tyson, and you add a big man in Dawes Amac, and suddenly you look like a team that's going to compete a little bit. Is this team going to be relevant? I'm not sure I'd go that far. I am not sure that they're going to climb fully out of the cellar in the Pac-12. I would project this roster to be better than Oregon State's roster. I would project this roster to probably be better than Stanford, although Stanford has some young kids coming in who could be really, really productive, like Peja Stojakovic's son is a big addition for them. But I would probably still put them a little bit over in that conversation. And then you got Washington, Washington State, Utah. All three of those programs are kind of stuck in the middle of the Pac-12. I could see Cal being in that conversation, which, to be clear, is not like a super enticing place to be. Middle of the pack in the pack is not an NCAA tournament team. You finish middle of the Big 12, you're in the NCAA tournament. You finish middle of the SEC, you're in the NCAA tournament. You finish middle of the Big 10, you are in the NCAA tournament. And I think the same of the ACC. Middle of the Pac-12, not dancing. Last year, I think 4 teams made it, and one of them was a play-in for Arizona State. Of course, 2 of those 4 teams were USC and UCLA. So at this point, we're not sure what the Pac-12 is going to look like, if it looks like anything at all in 2 years. So I'm not sure that it really matters. But for Cal to climb into the middle portion of the Pac-12 in the first year under Mark Madsen would be an overwhelming success. When you go 3-29, it's hard to not find the following season successful. Certainly, if they were to go 5-27, yes, it would be an improvement, but it would still be quite bad. I expect Cal to be more in the 15 to 18 win range, which is a significant improvement. Significant. Are they going to be challenging for an NCAA tournament spot? No, but give Madsen 3 years and maybe. Again, it's really hard to project because 3 years from now, Cal might be in the Mountain West. Like, I really genuinely have no idea what is going to be happening at that point. And that's going to kind of lead into what we're talking about next week. We're going to continue to have these conversations about conference realignment. What does it mean for the Pac-12? What does it mean for the Big 10 and the Big 12 and the programs that they are likely at this point going to be adding to their conference? What does it mean for UConn? Is the Big East going to lose any schools? Gonzaga, how are they going to be involved? There are endless conversations to be had about conference realignment, and we're going to come back with those conversations next week. But that is going to wrap us up for today and for this week. Thank you so much for making the Locked On College Basketball your first listen of the day. Shout out to those everyday listeners, whether you are on a podcast platform or on YouTube. If you haven't done so yet and you want to, go ahead and hit that subscribe button on YouTube. It is very much appreciated. Once again, thank you all for listening. Have a fantastic weekend. And until next time, peace out.